Okay, I hope everyone can see that okay. Somebody shout if not. Thank you again for the introduction and also the invitation to be here. It's really a nice opportunity for me, as you will hear, to think some of my research in the context of this notion and this field of study around planetary health, which is something that's new to me. So this is something that I will definitely ask for your participation and discussion around. How do we think about science communication, in particular in the context of planetary health and the climate crisis, and more generally the notion of wicked problems. What I'm going to do in thinking about this question, this overarching and very broad question of what is science communication for, I will do two things. I will talk a little bit about some research that has been published and which speaks to this question. How can we think about the role of science communication in society? I saw a few names that I recognize in the participant list. If anyone has heard about this work before or read the paper, I apologize because I am going to repeat a little bit what is there already. But the second thing I want to do is exactly to think about this, this research, these ideas in the context of the themes of this symposium. So this is the more speculative kind of side of the presentation that I will give, where I'm trying to think with ideas like wicked problems and planetary health. Where am I going over the next 20 minutes or so? As you've already heard, the question that I want to frame the presentation as a whole is this kind of very broad one: what is science communication for? And I will talk a little bit in a moment about why I think that's a useful question. I will then introduce the research that I've just mentioned, which looks at what scholars, teachers, and the literature on science communication have to say about the roles of science communication in society. And then, as I said, I want to kind of open up a more speculative set of reflections and questions that I have. What is missing in this research, in these ideas? How does a context of wicked problems and planetary health change things? Mike or John, I rely on you if I get too carried away to let me know about the time, if that's okay.
Sure, no problem.
So I start with this question: what is science communication for? What is our science communication for? The practices that we are involved in as communicators of research. So this is, of course, a big question, but also kind of a banal one in many ways. I'm quite sure that everybody here has their own answers to it. We know what we are aiming for, whether that's implicit or explicit, when we carry out public communication. And this can, of course, be a whole range of purposes and goals. It might be, for instance, to change behaviors. We might want the people that we are communicating with to be informed about particular health practices, for instance, and to change their behaviors based on that. We might want people to change environmental behaviors or to become involved in politics or activism in particular ways. We might also simply want to share our own excitement and enthusiasm about science and about the natural world. This is also, I think, a rather common rationale and driver for public communication, to share the awe that we feel about the natural world and the scientific processes that tell us more about it. We might also have more instrumental goals. We might want to encourage young people to get interested in science and perhaps eventually to pursue it as a career. So there are many things that science communication is for. I think as reflective practitioners, we all have some ideas about those. What I want to do, though, in thinking about this question of the purpose of science communication is to step out, to take a broader perspective, to move away from these immediate goals and aims, and to ask how we can characterize the broader purposes and value of science communication, not only within a specific context, but to the societies that we live in more generally. How can we think about the place that science communication plays in our societies? How can we perhaps categorize and organize the different roles that it has? So that's the first thing I want to talk about based on some research. The second thing, as I've already suggested, is to think specifically about the context of climate crisis, planetary health, wicked problems, the context of the themes of this symposium. So to ask not only what are the purposes of science communication in society, but specifically, what are the purposes of science communication in the context of planetary health, in the context of the work of many people here? And I know this is obviously something that I am only starting to think about, so I look forward to learning from people working in this area and kind of gaining from that discussion. I'm also taking this framing, particularly of wicked problems, from the symposium. So thinking about science communication in a context where issues are not one-dimensional or straightforward or only touch upon technical issues, but where there are complex interdependencies, many overlapping kind of issue definitions and approaches, and where society, politics, and science and technology all overlap. So how can we think about science communication's role within this context of what is often called wicked problems? So the first thing, as I said, I want to do is to try and systematically somehow characterize the role of science communication in society and how we can think about that. I'm drawing here on findings from an interview study, a qualitative interview study carried out with scholars and teachers of science communication in Europe, and also from a literature study looking at how the role of science communication has been characterized in science communication literature. So this work was carried out as part of the Quest project, which was a Horizon 2020 project, which is very recently finished. If you're interested in the projects as a whole, as well as this aspect, small aspect of it, please do go to the website, which has, I have to say, some fantastic resources also about carrying out science communication. This work has already been published as a research note in the journal Science Communication. So this is also why I'm kind of speaking quite quickly about these findings and the methods, because if you're interested, this is open access. Please do go and take a look there. So this study, this research, which sought to characterize the role of science communication in society, what emerged from it is that there are, or I found, at least 6 ways of thinking about the societal purpose or value of science communication. So I will talk briefly through each of these. I hope briefly, I will try briefly, and then move on to the more speculative reflections on what this means for planetary health. So what do scholars, teachers, and the literature have to say about the role of science communication in society? The first theme, the first kind of cluster of ideas circle around notions of accountability and legitimacy and responsibility. These arguments are based essentially on the fact that much science is publicly funded. We pay for it as taxpayers, and that therefore is a responsibility of science and scientists to allow that work to be publicly available, to have perhaps some accountability relationships in there as well. So this comes across, of course, in the quote, those who receive public funding for their research have a duty to explain how that money is spent. So there's responsibility there, and there's also the notion that this ensures legitimacy. A second kind of cluster of responses perhaps build on these notions of accountability and legitimacy. So a second cluster or theme is oriented towards democracy, that science communication plays an essential role in society because it is part of democratic engagement with and governance of science. This could take different forms in the interviews. It might, for instance, be about equipping citizens so that they have access to the science, the resources that they need to participate in political debates. It might also be about enabling critical debate about science, its role and purposes and priorities. It might also be a kind of more general involvement in being a good citizen, that you can access and work with scientific skills and critical thinking. So this is summed up perhaps in the quote where one scholar said, science communication is essentially about deliberation on how knowledge is being produced, created, and transferred in society today. So science communication should be deliberative. It should be enhancing the democratic governance and public involvement in research. A third set of ideas circled around culture, the cultural value and relevance of science and science communication as a part of culture and giving access to public audiences to what this speaker frames as one of humanity's greatest achievements. So in these responses, science is seen as something similar to art or to music. It's something that has emerged from our civilizations and therefore that is part of our shared heritage, that everyone has the right to be able to access and to enjoy. So here, this set of responses is less about democracy and more about being able to partake in the beauties and the wonders of science, to celebrate it as a societal achievement. A fourth rationale is essentially pragmatic or practical. Science communication is important because science is useful. It's useful to us as members of the public. Scientific knowledge can help us in our day-to-day lives. It's useful for policymakers and politicians. They should also have access to science to help them make good decisions. And it's also useful, this is less in the quote here, but other people said this, it's useful because scientists also get useful practical information from being involved in science communication and public engagement. They also can learn from public views and experiences and values. So here you have this notion, science brings a quality of knowledge production that is unusual, that is special. Getting that knowledge into individual and institutional or societal decisions is important. So there's an instrumental value to science communication here. The final two clusters of rationales are perhaps a little bit different. This fifth one emerged from the interviews, but in a different way to the others because it was framed as a negative, essentially. So whereas the other rationales were seen as positive aspects of science communication's role in society, this one was something that was noticed and talked about as something that was very present, but which was seen as something unhelpful and unhealthy. So in the interviews, people often spoke about science communication as taking the form of marketing and promotion, kind of an unreflective PR activity. Universities were seen as particularly guilty in this regard. So this was seen as a rather simplistic or overly straightforward effort to promote particular aspects of science or particular institutions, to persuade people to have particular instrumental goals in mind. So this was something that was noticed as a role, something that science communication does, but which was not seen as positive. And that's something I will come back to, because for me at least, I think it's not entirely that straightforward. The sixth rationale, or the sixth argument, I also want to mention, didn't really come up in our interviews, but is present in the literature. So I think it's worth including. And this was a kind of economic argument. Science communication is important because it's important for knowledge societies and their economic growth and development. So this, for instance, is about the need for scientists, so the need to recruit people into science, the need for a workforce that is scientifically literate and has perhaps technical skills. So this notion, the reference comes from a paper by Jonathan Osborne, that an advanced technological society needs a constant supply of scientists to sustain its economic base. So those are the six roles that we can see in the interviews and in the literature. This is one way of characterizing the role and value of science communication in societies, one way of passing out different categories. At the very least, I think based on this, we can say that science communication has multiple roles in society. And I think it's important also to say that these are of course, not exclusive. They often overlap and are entangled with each other. And here I want to return to the marketing role, the promotion role that our interviewees were so negative or less positive about. This relates to another distinction that appears in the science communication literature, which distinguishes between strategic and democratic forms of science communication. This comes from the work of Susanna Priest. So she says that if you're thinking about the role of science communication, many of the arguments for it essentially relate to enhancing democracy, as I've already talked about, to encouraging deliberation, to enabling public involvement in scientific priority setting, for instance. So seeing science communication as a process that is deliberative and open and democratic. She distinguishes these from what she calls strategic forms of communication, which are instrumental. They have particular goals in mind, such as persuading people of particular things, changing people's minds, and also enabling particular kinds of behavior changes. So this is one distinction that appears in the literature, and which we also see in the interviews in this discussion of marketing and promotion versus other forms of science communication, other roles of science communication. One important point I also want to draw out from these roles is that we can kind of step even further back and look at what they are saying about the assumptions about the kinds of societies we want to live in together. So in emphasizing things like the need for people to be able to access cultural heritage, the need for democratic engagement with science, the need for people to be able to access practical skills and resources. These ideas fundamentally relate to the nature of the societies that we live in two ways, I would say. So if we step even further back from these six roles, we can argue that the way in which people talk about the role and value of science communication, that is about an idea of the correct functioning of democratic societies and about the correct functioning of equitable societies. So we can see these roles as fitting into a notion that we want to nurture inclusive democratic processes, and accountability on the one hand, and to nurture the sharing of public goods, such as knowledge and culture, on the other. This is useful, I think, for any of us who are practitioners or who think about science communication, because ultimately it suggests that our science communication is important for reasons that go beyond perhaps the immediate setting, but because it is nurturing particular versions of society. So when we are carrying out science communication, we are also speaking to questions and ideas about the kinds of societies we wish to live in together. Okay, that took me longer than I was hoping. What I want to finish with is to kind of push these findings, these ideas a little bit further, to think about what is missing from this discussion, how we might want to develop it, and particularly what these ideas might mean in the context of planetary health and the climate crisis. One thing I think is missing is a kind of perspective from citizens. What are citizens getting from science communication? Why are they accessing it and using it? For what ends? How do they see it? Those who consume and use science communication, what are they doing that for? How do they see it as fitting into wider society? This is one very open question. I also have a question about the specificities of these roles, in particular techno-scientific contexts. Here, I think planetary health is the obvious one to think about. So if we consider these roles, cultural, democratic, practical, economic, and so on, what do they look like as you are communicating about planetary health? What do these things mean in practice? How do they relate to particular topics and issues and kinds of science communication that you might be engaged in? And for me, one thing that I find particularly interesting and challenging is this notion of science communication as enhancing democracy, but also perhaps as having strategic goals. How do we combine these things? Often they are framed as very separate, as we've seen in the interview data. People saw the instrumental forms of science communication that really focused on particular ends as being different to the more open-ended nurturing of democracy, where there is more of a conversation rather than a particular focus in terms of behavior change or changing people's minds. How do we combine these things? How do we find ways of nurturing democracy while at the same time having particular ends in mind? For me, I think we could also frame this as the question, what does it mean to be convinced both of the urgency of an issue, such as climate change, and of the value of democratic engagement with it? How can we believe seriously in the directions that science is taking us and the need for change at multiple levels, and also engage in open-ended, deliberative communication and engagement around it? In starting to think about this, I am drawing on existing work by a number of scholars. I guess particularly work by Candice Callison on climate change, which I find really fantastic and helpful. Perhaps in thinking about how to develop these approaches to science communication, we might think of it as nurturing shared sense-making about the issues that face our societies, so that we are going into communication seeking to develop new mutual understandings around particular issues, where we are bringing our own expertise and knowledge, but at the same time being open to the presence of other forms of expertise and knowledge and values and experiences. Perhaps this is one way to overcome this democratic strategic tension within public communication. The final question, what can and should this look like? How do we do this in practice? If this is one way of thinking about how to carry out public communication in the context of the urgent issues of our times, how can we do this? How can we hold these things together, the urgency of an issue and the need for broad, open democratic engagement? What are the practices that might help with that? This is, as I said, the final question. I really look forward to hearing your experiences and views about that. I close by saying thank you for your patience. I think I was a little longer than I intended, and also particularly acknowledging and thanking the Quest team, the team involved in the project I mentioned earlier, and particularly my colleague at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Trine Unander, who carried out many of the interviews and without whom this research would not have been possible. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing questions and comments and ideas.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation and for really opening some fundamental questions about the nature of science communication. And I see that we have some questions coming up in the chat, so please do ask your questions in the chat. And in a moment, I will go to Julia to select some of those. Just before that, though, I particularly found your discussion of the distinction and this tension between the what you talked about as the strategic function of science communication versus the democratic function of science communication as extremely interesting and pertinent also to our project around planetary health and communication of planetary health. I mean, you talked at the beginning about science communication in order to change behaviors or to create a sense of wonder or to encourage people into particular careers, which is clearly very normative in terms of science communication. And on the other hand, you know, equipping people with tools to participate in a democracy and enabling people to be citizens through being scientifically informed, but also critically engaged with science seems like a very different goal, as you pointed out so well. And this is, I think, very interesting because in something like planetary health, one is also engaging with activism on the one hand, advocacy, and this, I think, is a tension that is very fascinating in terms of the more normative approaches to science communication as opposed to the enabling and providing tools to participate critically in a democracy. So maybe, could you say a little bit more before I jump to Julia about how you see that tension, because I find it really comes to the core of our project.
Yeah, I really think it's interesting and important, and I have to say I am also really struggling with what this means in practice. Also, I mean, this symposium is a nice opportunity for me to think about this, also in terms of my own life and work, right? Because in common with much, I think really the majority of scholarly work in science communication over recent years, my own commitments are to these more democratic modes of science communication. So thinking about science communication as dialogue, as deliberation, as empowering publics, as taking power away from elite institutions and kind of cultural forms, and putting that back more into publics. This is something I believe, as you know, is hugely important in the context of science communication and also more generally, I should say. At the same time, I am extremely convinced that we are living in a moment of kind of emerging climate crisis. That the scientific evidence is very clear, and we need to, as societies, to change our behaviors and practices. So this, as I say, is a tension I haven't really succeeded in resolving. Yeah, sorry, Michael John, I would be really happy to hear other people's experiences. I mean, I guess where I'm going with the notion of sense making is a kind of hope that we can create spaces and we can train ourselves to be able to come to discussion and deliberation and dialogue, bringing our own kind of knowledge and commitments while also being open to the knowledge and commitments of others, and reaching a shared understanding. But this is something, yeah, again, I would appreciate people's practical experiences, hearing about people's practical experiences around.
Thank you. Great. So now I'd like to go over to Julia. Julia, can you maybe share with us a question from the participants?
Luckily, we have many questions, and it's already hard to choose one. But I think some of those questions are pointing in the same direction. So I would perhaps cluster some of them. Hans-Bernd Brosius started with asking, or just stating, some researchers want to change knowledge, some want to change behaviors. How educational should science communication be? Or put it differently, what if knowledge does not change behavior? And I think, if I understand it in the right way, it relates a bit to a question from Marina Joubert, who asked, if we communicate to effect behavior change, is that inevitably persuasive communication? And how do we reconcile that with public engagement designed to listen to people rather than persuading them? And Rainer Kaufmann also says, is it really a scientific goal to change behavior? I think this is a political goal. Scientists can give the facts that show the need. So I think all those questions are dealing and pointing towards the question of how is it scientific to change behavior? Is this persuasion already? Is this political engagement? So I would appreciate an answer.
Yes, good questions. I mean, one immediate thought is that, of course, we know that an approach where we are just just the facts doesn't really change behaviors or attitudes. There is, I think, huge amounts of research in science communication now that providing people with facts can actually lead to further polarization without contextualization and narrative. So this notion of information provision as inevitably leading to behavior change, I think just doesn't fly anymore. So that's one point. So if we see ourselves as these kind of neutral arbiters, actually it's hard to see that as anything that could lead to behavior change. And Marina's question, if we communicate to affect behavior change, is that inevitably persuasive? Yeah, this is really fascinating, Marina. I would, of course, love to hear your views and experiences on it. I mean, I think something else we know from scholarship is that honest communication is also more effective. So if we are being honest about our motivations, that we are convinced of particular things and of the need to change our behaviors, for instance, this is likely to be much more effective than pretending that we do not have persuasive goals or that we are not wanting to effect certain changes. So this, I think, could be one strategy to communicate in a way that is honest and humble, but that is also kind of seeking to convey our own sense of urgency, the changes perhaps that we've made in our own lives and behaviors, and not kind of necessarily telling people that they have to change, not necessarily having that as the explicit aim of a communication activity, but rather kind of demonstrating our own partisanship in a way, our own commitments and the way in which we're convinced of the need for particular things.
Julia, do we have...
Yes, there is another aspect on which Christoph Mauch was touching upon, and he was bringing in the non-Western perspective, which I think is also very important when we deal with the question of communicating planetary health. He says, we are finding that indigenous societies have perhaps the deepest understanding of the connection between planetary and health, between humans, the natural world, the cosmos. On the other hand, democratic societies have shown themselves to be manipulative by corporate interests that have destroyed the environment, brought about climate change, and contributed to global environmental justice. How do you bring non-Western understandings into your concept?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great point. Again, it's something that I have also been thinking about. I mean, I think actually, we don't have to divide societies necessarily into democratic and non-democratic. I think the way in which people are talking about science communication as deliberation or enhancing democracy is very much about acknowledging multiple knowledge forms and being open to diverse perspectives. So I think an openness to indigenous knowledges that come from different kinds of sites and different kinds of practices is implicit in, at least in the ways in which the people that we spoke to were thinking about notions of democracy. I mean, all of this, of course, is really taking us to quite radical ideas about science communication. And again, I'm curious about people's experiences of trying to do this. How do you create spaces, fora, where we can have a diversity of knowledges and experiences and perspectives, Western and non-Western, and enable those to be treated in more equitable ways and to be open to those in more equitable ways. I would hope that this is kind of implicit in some of the democratic, so-called democratic arguments for the role of science communication, but I think it's also something that's very challenging, not least for those who have who live in the ivory tower, if you want.
Great. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, Julia.
Yeah, there was, I think, one of the key questions actually from our symposium today. So perhaps I put it just before I answer. I put the question that you're not asked to answer this question fully and totally. But I think it's very interesting what Faisal was asking sometimes, or commenting. Sometimes people can understand the urgency of a situation like climate change, but still not see enough value to act. How can communications be designed to translate from just understanding and knowledge to effective action? What would be your take on this central question?
So this again is something I don't feel especially well qualified to comment on, but fortuitously I was just reading an article by some other people. Lorraine Whitmas, Walter Pottinger, and Stuart Capstick, behavior change to address climate change. And they kind of systematically look at different models of what are the most effective ways to actually encourage people to act. So they say, for instance, that providing information is not enough, it doesn't do anything, and you have to be more strategic. For instance, in thinking about moments when people are particularly susceptible to changing their habits or routines, finding narratives and cultural stories that fit in with people's experiences. Really, all I know in terms of the answer to that question comes from this article, and I think from another body of work, a wider body of work around climate communication. So I'm afraid I just point everybody to that piece.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And there's also some interesting work on the roots of inaction by Amel and others in the ecological context, which is, I think, quite related to what Stuart Capstick and others say. And it's definitely a very important discussion. Julia, I think we may have to move on unless there's one more quick question that you would like to.
Actually, one more question, because I think it's very interesting what Bruce Loonstein just added. How well do we understand the differences between how scientists or researchers use science communication and how activisable persuasions use science communication? I think this is also very interesting questions. Perhaps you have also answers from your own research on that?
I mean, I don't know. And I actually think, Bruce, maybe you have some ideas. I actually think we don't know so much in the literature either about the answer to that question. One thing that I do know a little bit more about is how publics use science communication. And I can say that this is often very different to how it's envisioned by scientists. So we might have very specific goals or aims for our communication, but lay people, these may be totally invisible and also totally meaningless to them. So I think this is a kind of urgent question, both for practice when we're thinking about our audiences, what they need, what they want, and also for scholarship more generally. How do different kinds of people use science communication? Bruce, if you have any knowledge about that, share? Oh no, he says no.
Great, that was a quick answer at least. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Julia, and we'll be coming back to you in a little while, and we will also have a chance to speak more with Sarah in a few moments, so there will be a general discussion after our next speaker.
So I think we shall not lose any time. We just start, and let's see. The more people come, then we have questions. But does anybody of you have already a question for Sarah or something to comment on, and we get into discussion?
I can start. I mean, in terms of the big questions that you presented, Sarah, what do you think concretely is needed in terms of research? So, for example, the center, the newly founded center. So, what can we do? What should we do? What do we have to do?
Yeah, what a fabulous opportunity, and congratulations, I should say, to everyone involved on getting the funding, because I think this VW kind of scheme is really exciting. Yes. I mean, this came up a little bit in the discussion, particularly with regard to activists. But I think in terms of this community, but also more generally, we know quite a lot about how scientists and communicators think about public communication and how they imagine it and the aims for it. But I think we really know much less about how it fits into people's lives, how it is used and consumed. I mean, someone mentioned in the chat, we of course know some stuff from visitor studies and in looking at museums, for instance, but this is such a small sample of the population who choose to consume these kinds of science communication activities. I think it would be fantastic to know much more about, the everyday life of different communities or groups or populations, how they approach science, when they approach science, when and if they access different kinds of science communication. And activists are, of course, one category. I think Bruce, again, is right. I was thinking a little bit about this question. There are some interesting historical case studies about activists using science within their activism and kind of appropriating scientific knowledge or working with scientists or researchers in different ways. But I think we could know much more about how that happens, what people want from science communication, what kind of resources they're looking for, and how they use it and mobilize it. And I think, so now you ask me what kind of research I think should be done, and this is of course a long answer. But I think there's particularly a need for kind of longer term ethnographic exploratory studies that really look at people's own meanings and experiences. I know that there is, some more large-scale quantitative work on public attitudes to science, for instance, but this is very much framed again around scientists and researchers' assumptions and starting points. So I think it could be so interesting to do something that is more really exploring in the texture of everyday life how science is thought about and used. Yes, sorry. This is really a subject that's close to my heart. I've been wanting for a long time to, I tried for a while to get a kind of very open ethnographic study of science in everyday life funded, and that repeatedly failed. So of course I see this as something that could be useful and interesting. I don't know, how does that fit in with your own research plans and interests and your thoughts about the center?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, so I should say that I am from the public health department, so I am not a science communication researcher nor practitioner. I'm actually a doctor by background, but obviously affiliated to the planetary health field and active in this field. And so I'm currently asking myself how at this nexus we can actually do research together, maybe like me or my colleagues representing the public health perspective and the center, and what kind of questions and what kind of methods also we should or could employ there?
Yeah, I mean, actually, this is one area that I think in some ways, like sociology of medicine and sociology of public health is more advanced, because of course there has also been a really urgent need to understand, people's everyday practices around health, people's meanings around health, and how that can, and therefore how public health communication can be made to speak to those. So yeah, I would think you have a really rich background to draw on.
Yeah, I mean, one area of inquiry that I'm particularly interested in is actually this idea, and I think you alluded to it as well, of a shared ethos and shared values, and what planetary health as a concept might actually mean to different people, or the other way around, how this is actually already being enacted or lived upon by different cultures, but they just use different words for that, or a different concept. But with these, how can we actually then arrive at some kind of shared understanding, and from that to some kind of shared action, like common action towards a shared goal globally, urgent, like quickly? I think this is also very something that I grapple with. How can we do this and allow time for, as you say, year-long ethnographic studies, whilst we need some major shifts happening now? And difficult, I feel, to also not see myself in an activist role whilst doing research, or maybe should I? I've also been thinking about that. Like, what's our role as researchers in this?
I would like to ask Rainer Korbmann, who just had raised his hand, but then put it down again. But I would nevertheless ask if this question is still current. So please feel free to ask.
No, it was just a comment I wanted to make to Sarah's speech, or to the understanding of communicating planetary health in altogether, of all what I heard until now. I get the feeling that the communication is meant primarily from science to society. 2 points. First, everything science has is based by society. Second, you want, with the concept of planetary health, you want to make society decisions, if not even you want them to change their behavior. We had this before. How much do you know about society, what society wants? I think if you really want to have success, you must know structures in society, structures in communicate from society's reality into science. And this is, I'm missing very much in all the discussions about communicating planetary health.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a really excellent point. I mean, I think, Katerina, it also speaks to your interest, right, in understanding what is meaningful to people, how they are making sense of these questions, and then taking that as the starting point. So taking society's visions and values and stories as the starting point, rather than the natural science story. I also should say, Rainer, you also reminded me, it's so difficult often when we talk about these things, because I feel like you have to make so many simplifications. And I think also this model that I repeatedly use, where it's kind of science and society and there are these separate things, I think in reality, of course, it's so much more complicated. And I meant to say at some point, actually, I don't think we should talk about them when we talk about society. It's also us. And so just trying to acknowledge this entanglements, I think is really important. Thank you.
Helmut?
Yeah, yes, it was me who raised this question of audience research. What should we do then if we have done so much earlier, right, with very sophisticated techniques such as eye tracking, et cetera, But yeah, Rainer Korbmann is right. It's all, say, from the science to society and not vice versa. And so we have to go way more extramural. Go to the street, yeah. to get into a real dialogue with a participatory toolkit of really engaging with activists such as scientists for futures, writers for future, et cetera, et cetera. That's what we're also aiming at with our new center. Yes, we have to break these barriers more deliberately that we have done so. But on the other hand, we should also not forget that we already have a kind of baseline where we could embark on. It's not that we start with zero at the level zero in getting a better understanding of this dialogue. This really, also what has been mentioned earlier, we have to pay more tribute. You also mentioned that, Sarah, with emotions and not just coming from facts, but also from emotions, and not emotions management, but understanding emotions as a very, very important factor when it comes to decision making, when it comes to worldviews, be it on the individual level, be it on the collective level. Yes, so we have to transition to different instruments, but yeah, again, there is already a baseline.
I was just thinking as you were speaking, I think this is a really great point. I guess everybody here is probably familiar with the work of Emily Dawson, looking at people who were not consuming science communication, who actively feel excluded from it. I mean, I think this body of work, which is kind of emerging and growing, and I think is, of course, also coming from other places and people, I think this is also a really fantastic baseline to understand really the people outside, even the imagination of the visitor studies kind of body of work.
Bruce, please.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this is Sarah, you and Sam gave really great talks, and I really enjoyed them. And I think picking up on this audience piece, I think one of the, while I agree with Helmut that there's some baseline knowledge that we could work with, I also think that this is one of the places where we need to be pretty humble about what we know, and who we've talked with. And we also have to be willing to use some techniques that maybe are not traditional in our academic research communities. What I'm thinking of here is that the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is a major public health foundation in the United States, funded by Zuckerberg of Facebook, they have a science communication unit, and what they've been doing is doing traditional marketing research around the United States about what do people think about science and public health issues. So they've been running focus groups, and they've been creating personae, which is the tool that marketers use to try to identify things. They've presented a little bit about it. I actually haven't heard an update in about a year, so partly because of the pandemic, so we haven't seen each other, but so I don't know exactly where they are, but I think that's the kind of tool that perhaps some of us in the social science research community should be thinking about using. Is in a couple of places, Germany, the US, UK, but also picking up on Sarah's last point, also going to South Africa and Brazil and Colombia and other places where we might have connections, to do some basic audience research to understand, does the term planetary health make sense to people? How do they understand these connections among the different components? Are there other terms that people that might make more sense? I mean, I think Sam made the point that many people think of human health and planetary health as separate, when from an academic intellectual point of view, no, there's a single thing. But if the audiences we're trying to reach, we're trying to talk with, probably still think of them as separate. And so is there some other label we should be using? And I think, again, if we're thinking about research agendas, if we're thinking about how do we move this forward, that might be a way to go.
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right, Bruce, because I think the same applies to the question of public health and individual health, that we have the same problem that many people think about public health, like with the COVID-19 pandemic, is nothing which affects me, or what is my part in this. So I think this is always the question of how we relate the individual level to the macro level of society, or the global planet itself. So I think this will be one of the focus of our work at the Munich Science Communication level. We want to just simply know more how to effectively communicate the interconnectedness of these levels, and how can we make it clear to the people without putting too much into the message, because sometimes it can also be like too much for the people to grasp at one moment, so that they are affected and that the society is also affected. This is something which we right now experience in Germany, where we have this flood. So on the one hand, this is a perfect moment to talk about the climate change. On the other hand, the people say, well, this is not the right moment to talk about climate change, because there were people dying, and first of all we have to clean up, and now is the question, how do the people get their money, and now is the question how how to deal with this situation at hand, and to find also the right moment for the right communication. I think this is also an important question. There are two more questions, so I put my questions back, and I think Winfried Rausche, you were first. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Coming back to the remark of Bruce Lowenstein about audiences and how they understand an expression like planetary health. I'm working at the Helmholtz Center Munich for environmental and human health. And there, among my colleagues, no one really could answer the question, what might be planetary health? They needed help for that. So I think this is an expression which either has to be really pushed among the scientific community to get a real meaning outside in a broader public, or it will not work. So I think it's a really hard task to even explain it within the scientific community. It's possible, of course, but it is a hard rock to move.
Julia and others involved in the center, I guess this will be really an interesting challenge over the next years to really unpack this term and to think about how to make it meaningful, how to tell stories about it to scientists.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I was also thinking about the connection between like storytelling and framing, because on the one hand, we are talking about the need for new narratives and storytelling. And I was wondering what is happening when the frame gets framed, because what we don't have it under control, I mean, we can make videos like Sam presented to us from the Planetary Health Alliance, and this video also shows multiple narratives and stories in itself. For example, the story of human exceptionalism and so on. But then when we go outside, into the public sphere, when we are we bring this into social media, for example, then it gets decontextualized, and then I think it's very interesting to see what happens when this message gets framed with other, for example, events or interest groups or problems and so on. I mean, we see this also in the field of climate justice. By the way, that would also be a question I would perhaps ask, as you worked also on social movements. I mean, how do we deal with the fact that planetary health is on the one hand a research field and on the one hand a social movement? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I haven't worked so much with social movements, actually. I worked a bit with hackers, who I think are a very special kind of social movement. I was actually thinking earlier in one of the, I can't remember, one of the conversations, I think in response to Sam's presentation, that there is, of course, this long history of action research in social research, but also beyond. And I was reflecting on perhaps this might provide resources in terms of how to manage this kind of dual persona of the activist and the scholar, or the person who is seeking to change something and also to understand something. I don't know whether anyone involved has a kind of history or experience with that tradition, but perhaps it could be interesting as a resource.
So Julia Scharschmidt, you had a question also. I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry. Yeah, I thought it was very interesting also what Bruce said and also what Sarah said about taking a step back and looking at bubbles that we have, because we speak to a lot of people who are in the educational system or who do research or who are very interested in those subjects anyways. And I think it's very important to take a step back and also consider those people who maybe have no connection to those sciences or those departments. And I think it's very interesting what Sarah said about the finding or looking at the everyday life and how do these people take information, on what channels do they, like, do middle-aged or older people really look at social media movements and Fridays for Future and all those types of things. So I think science communication has maybe reached a lot of young people and a lot of people who are interested in those types of things and who are active in those fields. But maybe, I don't know, Sarah, if you have any information on that, if you know about social movements or about science communication, especially towards groups who are not in this world of science and who are not in this world of, maybe not even science, that's wrong, because most people are not in the world of science that we want to talk to, but of people who may not even know a lot of stuff about anything planetary health or anything public health.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the work of Emily Dawson before, and I really think her body of work has been really powerful in starting to unpack that. I can also see that in the US in particular, there is much more of a concern with audiences who would never choose to kind of consume science communication, and thinking about how to meet people where they are, and to kind of understand communities' own needs and priorities, and kind of start with that work of understanding, and then only then come to the science or the science communication. Bruce, I also really like your suggestion of this kind of market research or this exploratory understanding of not starting with planetary health necessarily, but starting with what are people's life worlds, what are their priorities, their experiences, what are their concerns, particularly as they relate to perhaps the ideas incorporated in planetary health, but not using that language, not using the science, just thinking, what are their experiences? And then again, taking that as the starting point for thinking about how to communicate, or I think also how to do the science as well, right? What is meaningful to people, what is necessary, and then taking that back to science and to science communication. So you're really starting with people's own experiences and values and priorities. It's of course, again, Julia, this relates to your point about the kind of tensions of timing, because this is of course slow, challenging work that involves building trust with communities. And yeah, that can be very difficult, both in funding cycles and in situations that are urgent, I guess.
So are there any more questions or comments on the topic, or Bruce, any task for the Munich Science Communication Lab?
I've already given too many, but just to pick up on Sarah's last point about trying to really understand the meanings that different communities have. One of the things that came out of Sam's talk was our need to pay attention to spirituality and religions, and I was intrigued by there are religious traditions in which we as humans have the right to use resources. There are also sometimes the same religious traditions in which we have an obligation to care for the earth. And I know very little about these traditions and how they work together and so on, but I think that's one of the things that we need to pay a lot of attention to, is that even though in many of our cultures that we come from, commitment to organized religion is sometimes low, and yet commitment to a religious belief or a spiritual belief is sometimes very high. And I think that's another area where we need to understand a lot more of how that intersects with our understanding of the spiritual dimensions of planetary health.
Absolutely, I was thinking the same. I mean, the video tries to include this also, but I think this is also, it's difficult. I mean, and also because religions have different takes on the subject and different aspects, and perhaps we are used to in the Western perspective that this is not a big problem for us, but I think when it comes to other cultures in other countries, and also in countries where there is more effects of climate crisis already experienced, then we have to take this also into consideration, also when it comes to cope with the effects of climate crisis. Then we need the spirituality, to become heroes, as Sam said. So thank you very much. I will close this session and we go back to the main session. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all of you for participating in this breakout room. See you.
Thank you, everybody.